So, picture this. You wake up one morning, sun shining, birds chirping, ready to tackle the day, and bam! There's an official-looking envelope from your homeowners association that has the power to curdle your coffee. Now, I'm a reasonable guy. I pay my dues on time, keep my lawn pristine, the whole suburban dream package. But this particular letter, it informed me I owed the HOA the tidy sum of $20,000. Yeah, you heard me right. 20, 0. And for what, you ask? For the egregious crime of having too many cars. I'm Mike, by the way, and if you think that sounds insane, buckle up, because this story gets wilder. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because you won't believe how this HOA nightmare turned into my own personal masterclass in payback. It all started, as these things often do, with someone who had a little too much time on their hands and a dangerous amount of perceived power. In our case, that someone was Penelope Price, or President Penny, as she undoubtedly preferred to be addressed, ruler of the cul-de-sacs and queen of the meticulously manicured lawns of Harmony Creek Estates. Let me set the scene. My family and I had moved into Harmony Creek about 3 years prior. It was supposed to be idyllic. Good schools for our daughter Emily, who was then finishing high school, quiet streets, a community pool we rarely used but appreciated knowing was there. I'm a commercial real estate developer, with a decent bit of experience in property law and zoning intricacies, a fact that will become excruciatingly relevant later. My wife, Sarah, is an architect. We do okay. We're not flamboyant, but we appreciate nice things that reflect our hard work. Our vehicular fleet, the source of all this impending doom, consisted of 3 cars. My pride and joy, a C8 Corvette, usually tucked away in the garage, a gleaming monument to American engineering. Sarah's daily driver was an Audi Q8, a comfortable and stylish SUV perfect for her site visits and hauling blueprints. And then there was Emily's car, an Audi RS5, which she drove when she was home from college. It usually stayed with us when she was away at school, safely garaged. 3 cars. For a 3-car garage and a spacious 4-car driveway, by no stretch of the imagination was our property looking like a used car lot. Most days, only Sarah's Queet was consistently visible in the driveway if she wasn't out. My Corvette saw daylight on weekends or special occasions. Emily's RS5? It was usually either in the 3rd bay of the garage or parked neatly on one side of our wide driveway when she was home. Never on the street, never blocking a sidewalk, always immaculate. The first shot across the bow came as a benign-looking email. Friendly reminder. Vehicle parking regulations. It outlined the HOA's policy. No more than two vehicles may be regularly parked outside of a garage. Regularly. That was the key word, or so I thought. I skimmed it, figured it was a general broadcast, and thought nothing more of it. After all, Emily was away at school. Her car was garaged. My Corvette was garaged. Only Sarah's Queet was a regular driveway resident. A week later, another email. This one directly addressed to me. Subject. Second notice, vehicle parking violation. It stated that multiple vehicles had been observed consistently parked outside our garage, specifically mentioning 3. 3? I did a quick mental inventory. Emily was home for a weekend visit, perhaps her RS5, Sarah's Queet, and maybe I'd left the Corvette out after a wash. Highly unlikely I'd leave all 3 out overnight, but okay. I replied politely, explaining Emily was visiting, her car would be garaged again by Monday, and typically only 1 vehicle was parked out. I even attached a photo of our usually empty driveway, with just Sarah's Queet 8 parked neatly. I expected that to be the end of it. How wrong I was. This is where President Penelope Price truly entered the picture, transforming from a vague figurehead I'd see at the occasional annual meeting into my personal suburban nemesis. Penelope was a woman who seemed to derive her entire sense of self-worth from the HOA covenants. She was in her late 50s, impeccably, if somewhat ostentatiously, dressed in designer tracksuits, even when just patrolling the neighborhood in her massive, pearl-white Cadillac Escalade, a vehicle, I might add, That seemed to take up more space than any three of ours combined. Her blonde hair was always coiffed into a rigid helmet, her smile tight and condescending. She was the type who'd measure your grass with a ruler if she thought it was a quarter-inch too long. The next communication wasn't an email, it was a certified letter. Notice of violation and intent to fine. It claimed persistent and flagrant disregard for vehicle parking regulations, and cited observations on multiple dates of 3 vehicles. It included a grainy photo, clearly taken from an awkward angle down the street, showing our 3 cars in the driveway from Emily's recent weekend visit, and it levied an initial fine of $500. I was annoyed, but still in let's sort this out reasonably mode. I called Penelope. Her tone was syrupy sweet, yet utterly inflexible. "Michael, dear," she began as if speaking to a slow child. "Rules are rules. We can't have Harmony Creek looking untidy. 3 cars visible, it's simply too much. It lowers property values." I calmly explained again that this was an anomaly due to our daughter visiting, that our standard was 1, occasionally 2 if I moved my car. "Well," she trilled, "our committee has photographic evidence. Multiple occasions." "Multiple occasions?" I pressed her for dates. She became vague. "The committee reviews these things very carefully, Michael." She suggested I attend the next HOA board meeting if I wished to dispute it. Fine. I'd attend. I'd bring my garage door opener to demonstrate. The board meeting was a masterclass in petty tyranny. Penelope sat center stage at a folding table in the community clubhouse, flanked by 2 equally smug-looking board members, a nervous-looking treasurer, and a secretary, who seemed terrified to make eye contact. I presented my case, logically and calmly. I explained our typical parking habits. I even offered to install a security camera pointed at my driveway to provide irrefutable, time-stamped evidence if they doubted me. Penelope listened, tapping a pen against a stack of papers. When I finished, she smiled that thin, reptilian smile. "Thank you for your perspective, Michael. However, the covenants are quite clear. And the visual impact of 3 high-end sports cars and luxury SUVs can be quite ostentatious for our community's image." Ostentatious? My Corvette? Sarah's Quate? Emily's RS5? They were nice cars, sure, but ostentatious? In a neighborhood where half the residents drove Teslas, Range Rovers, and yes, Penelope's own land yacht of an Escalade? I pointed this out politely. "Ah, but Mrs. Price's vehicle is a single vehicle, and she is the president," one of her cronies interjected, as if that made any sense. The hypocrisy was astounding. The board upheld the fine. The very next week, another letter arrived. Fine. 1-0. Apparently, we had continued our violation. Emily was back at college. Her car was securely in the garage. Only Sarah's car was in the driveway. I sent a furious email with photos of my empty driveway and single car. The response? An automated reply. The letters kept coming. The fines escalated with each new violation. 2-0, 5-0, then 10-0. They were clearly fabricating these observations, or were just determined to penalize us regardless of reality. Each letter cited new, vague dates of infractions. It was then that the big one landed. The certified letter that felt like a punch to the gut. Total outstanding fines. 20-0. With a threat of a lien on our property, if not paid within 30 days. $20,000 for legally parking our own cars on our own property. That was the moment something snapped. The incredulity, the frustration, it all coalesced into a cold, hard resolve. Penelope Price in her little kingdom had picked a fight with the wrong homeowner. She had no idea who she was dealing with, or just how far I was willing to go when pushed. My background in real estate development, my understanding of property law, land use, contracts, it all started churning in my mind. This wasn't just about cars anymore. This was about abuse of power, about bullies in blazers. And I decided then and there, Penelope Price was going to learn a very expensive lesson. The sheer audacity of a 20-0 fine for something so trivial so demonstrably false, was staggering. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. It was Penelope Price, with her condescending tone and her Cadillac Escalade that probably violated more visual blight rules than my entire garage, arbitrarily deciding to target my family. As a commercial real estate developer, my bread and butter is navigating complex legal frameworks, zoning ordinances, and often labyrinthine bureaucracies. My professional life involved meticulous research, due diligence, and strategic negotiation. Penelope Price clearly saw me as just another homeowner to steamroll. She'd underestimated me. Badly. The first thing I did was dive deep into the Harmony Creek Estates HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CCRs. I'd read them when we bought the house, of course, but now I pored over them with a forensic eye. The vehicle clause was indeed there. No more than two vehicles may be regularly parked outside of a garage on any lot. The key words, as I'd initially thought, were regularly parked. How was regularly defined? The document offered no clarification. It was subjective, vague, and ripe for abuse, exactly what Penelope was exploiting. There were no provisions for visitor parking duration, no specified observation period to determine regularity. It was a poorly written rule, likely a boilerplate carried over from some generic HOA template. I started documenting everything. Every letter from the HOA, every email I sent, dates, times, contents. I set up a discreet security camera covering my driveway, not just for evidence against their bogus claims, but also to see who might be observing my property. The footage was illuminating. It confirmed what I suspected. On most days, only Sarah's Queet was in the driveway. When Emily's car was there during her brief visits, it was temporary. Crucially, the camera also caught Penelope Price herself, on several occasions, driving slowly past my house in her Escalade, pausing, phone in hand, clearly taking pictures. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late in the evening. It was targeted harassment, plain and simple. This wasn't some impartial committee observation. This was President Penny on a personal vendetta. My next step was to understand the HOA's power structure and finances. As a homeowner, I was entitled to review certain HOA records. I formally requested copies of board meeting minutes for the past 2 years, financial statements, and a detailed breakdown of how fine revenue was assessed and utilized. The initial response was resistance. The HOA secretary, a mousy woman named Carol who seemed perpetually intimidated by Penelope, hemmed and hawed, citing privacy and procedural delays. I gently reminded her of my rights under state law and the HOA's own bylaws. The documents eventually arrived, and they were a goldmine. The meeting minutes were sanitized, offering little insight into actual deliberations, but they did show a pattern. Penelope Price proposed, the board, mostly her loyal acolytes, Barry and Janice, rubber stamped. Barry was a retired middle manager with an inflated sense of importance, and Janice, from what I could gather, ran a small, struggling dog-walking business from her home and seemed to think currying favor with Penny would elevate her social standing. The treasurer, a quiet accountant named Arthur Jenkins, occasionally raised feeble objections noted in the minutes, only to be overruled. The financial statements were even more interesting. The HOA had a surprisingly large, discretionary fund that Penelope controlled with minimal oversight, and there was a significant line item for legal consultations that seemed to balloon whenever Penelope was challenged. Where was all this fine money going? It certainly wasn't improving community amenities, which looked shabbier each year. The pool had a persistent algae problem, and the clubhouse paint was peeling. I also started talking to my neighbors, subtly at first. Many were cowed by Penelope. They'd share horror stories in hushed tones, fines for trash cans left out an hour too long, violations for the wrong shade of beige on their window trim, demands to remove perfectly healthy trees that Penelope deemed unsightly. Most just paid the fines to avoid trouble. A few had tried to fight her and been worn down by her relentless aggression and the HOA's apparently bottomless pit of legal funds for frivolous actions. One older gentleman, Mr. Henderson, a retired engineer, pulled me aside during one of my walks. "Be careful with Penny," he whispered. "She's got a mean streak, and she hates being questioned. She tried to fine me for my satellite dish, said it was too big. Took me 6 months and a letter from my lawyer to get her to back down." He mentioned something else, almost as an aside, that planted a seed. "She runs this place like it's her personal fiefdom. Wonder who actually owns the roads and the parkland these days? Used to be the developer, Old Man Hemlock, but he passed years ago." That casual remark resonated with my developer brain. Ownership, title, easements. These were the foundations of property rights. The HOA maintained the common areas, sure, but did they own them outright? Or was there an underlying owner, a master association, or some forgotten legal entity? This became the new focus of my investigation. I spent hours at the county records office, pulling deeds, plats, and incorporation documents related to Harmony Creek Estates. It was tedious, dusty work, but I was in my element. I traced the lineage of the land, parcel by parcel. Harmony Creek was developed in the late 1980s by Hemlock Properties, Inc. The initial plats dedicated certain areas as common area for the use of lot owners and outlined the formation of the Harmony Creek Estates HOA to manage these standard stuff. But then I found something odd. The deeds transferring ownership of the roads, the small park with the sad-looking gazebo, the greenbelt areas, and even the land under the clubhouse and pool, from Hemlock Properties, Inc. to the Harmony Creek Estates HOA, were sloppy. One parcel, a long strip of land that constituted the main access road into the newer section of the development where my house was, seemed to have a murky title history. There was an initial deed of transfer, yes, but then a subsequent corrective deed filed a few years later that appeared to only partially clarify the transfer, leaving certain residual rights or ambiguities. And Hemlock Properties, Inc., the original grantor? According to state records, it had been administratively dissolved over a decade ago for failure to file annual reports and pay franchise taxes. Its assets, if any remained unclaimed or improperly transferred, would theoretically escheat to the state or, in some cases, could be claimed by creditors or even potentially acquired by an interested party, if the dissolution wasn't perfectly executed. This was getting interesting. What if the HOA didn't have clear, undisputed title to all the land they purported to control, and on which they based their authority to fine me for parking on my private property, which happened to be accessed via their supposed roads? While I was digging into this, Penelope wasn't idle. The 20-0 demand was followed by a final notice before lien, delivered by a smug-looking process server. The pressure was mounting. I had to attend another board meeting, this time with the threat of a lien hanging over my head. At this meeting, I tried a different tack. I presented clear evidence, a logbook and the security footage showing my driveway's typical state, proving I wasn't regularly parking 3 cars out. I even had a sworn affidavit from Emily about her visitation schedule and car usage. Penelope watched the footage on the small TV I brought, her expression unreadable but for a slight tightening around her lips. When it finished, she said, "Mr. Henderson, the camera footage can be edited, and your daughter would naturally support your claims. The fact remains, the committee has its own observations. The fine stands, pay it, or the lien will be filed next week." Barry and Janice nodded dutifully. Arthur Jenkins, the treasurer, looked down at his papers, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. It was then that I realized, reasoning with Penelope Price was like arguing with a brick wall, a very expensive, designer-clad brick wall. She wasn't interested in facts or fairness. She was interested in power and, I suspected, in making an example of me. Maybe she was jealous of our cars, our lifestyle, or maybe she just didn't like anyone who wasn't sufficiently deferential. Whatever her motivation, she had drawn a line in the sand. Fine, I thought. If she wants to play hardball based on technicalities and rules, I can play that game too. But my game would involve stakes she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The seed Mr. Henderson planted about the ownership of the common lands. had now taken root and was starting to sprout into a rather audacious, very expensive, and potentially devastating plan. The HOA thought they could bleed me for 20-0 over phantom car violations. They had no idea what kind of storm they were about to unleash. I started thinking about those murky land titles, about the dissolved Hemlock Properties Inc. What if? What if someone could acquire those residual rights? What if someone could, quite literally, pull the rug out from under President Penelope Price's little empire? The idea was audacious, almost comical in its scope, but the more I examined the tangled mess of Hemlock Properties Inc.'s dissolution and the questionable chain of title for certain common areas in Harmony Creek, the more feasible it seemed. This wasn't just about avoiding a 20-0 fine anymore. This was about dismantling a petty dictatorship built on misused rules and the intimidation of good people. My professional life revolved around identifying undervalued or overlooked assets and unlocking their potential. What if the biggest overlooked asset here was the very ground the HOA stood on? I hired a specialist real estate attorney, not just any lawyer, but one renowned for unraveling complex title issues and corporate dissolutions. I laid out the situation, the HOA's harassment, the questionable fines, and my discovery regarding Hemlock Properties Inc., and the uncleared deeds for the common areas, particularly the main access roads and some greenbelt parcels. We needed to confirm who, if anyone, truly held unencumbered title. We also needed to see if there was a legal mechanism to acquire any lingering interests from the defunct Hemlock Properties Inc. My attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Reed, was initially skeptical, then intrigued. "Most HOAs get this stuff right, Mike," she said, peering at the plats and deeds I gathered. "But developers in the 80s could be surprisingly sloppy, especially with phased developments. And if Hemlock Properties was dissolved without properly conveying all assets, well, things can get interesting." The investigation deepened. Evelyn and her team delved into the escheatment laws of the state, the specific details of Hemlock Properties' corporate wind-down, or lack thereof, and traced every document related to the common lands of Harmony Creek. What emerged was a developer's worst nightmare, and my potential jackpot. Hemlock Properties Inc. had indeed been administratively dissolved. While they had attempted to convey all common areas to the HOA, the legal descriptions on several key parcels, including the primary ingress-egress roads for about a third of the neighborhood, my section included, and a significant portion of the passive parkland, were flawed. There were scrivener's errors, incorrect parcel numbers, and in one glaring instance, a deed that referenced a plat map that was never officially recorded for those specific sections of road. Legally speaking, clear title for these critical pieces of land had never properly transferred to the Harmony Creek Estates HOA. They were essentially operating on these lands under a cloud, perhaps assuming quiet title over the years, but without a perfect, defensible claim. And who held the residual interest from the dissolved Hemlock Properties Inc.? After a further deep dive, it turned out the assets, due to the nature of the dissolution and unpaid state franchise taxes at the time, were in a legal limbo. They hadn't formally escheated to the state in a way that precluded a private party from attempting to revive the corporate shell for the purpose of settling its affairs, or, more creatively, acquiring its residual, unrecorded interests directly from the state under specific tax recovery statutes, or even by tracking down any surviving shareholders or officers who might have a claim or the authority to act. This was it. This was the Achilles heel of Penelope Price's regime. Evelyn outlined a strategy. We could attempt to locate any surviving principals of Hemlock Properties Inc., if any existed, and were identifiable after so many years. More promisingly, certain state laws allowed for a complex process whereby a party could petition to be appointed as a receiver or trustee for a dissolved corporation specifically to marshal and convey its overlooked assets, particularly if there were outstanding tax claims the state wished to satisfy. Or, simpler still, if the state viewed these slivers of land as essentially abandoned and were willing to quitclaim them to resolve ambiguities and potentially get them back on tax rolls as privately owned, should that path open. My objective was control. To make this happen, anonymity was paramount. Penelope and her board couldn't get a whiff of what I was doing. I formed a new limited liability company. Let's call it Serene Pathways LLC, with Evelyn's firm acting as the registered agent. All communications, negotiations, and potential acquisitions would be done through this LLC, obscuring my involvement. The next few months were a blur of legal filings, quiet negotiations with state tax authorities, who were surprisingly amenable when presented with a way to clear up decades-old loose ends and recover some long-forgotten tax dues for Hemlock Properties, Inc., and meticulous title work. It turned out the state had a minor, long-dormant tax lien against Hemlock Properties for those unpaid franchise taxes. By satisfying that lien through Serene Pathways LLC, and through a carefully structured series of legal maneuvers allowable under state law for untangling assets of defunct corporations, Serene Pathways LLC was able to acquire quitclaim deeds from the state for those ambiguously titled parcels, the roads, the parkland. The state was essentially washing its hands of these messy, unmanaged slivers of land and was happy to see them conveyed to a party willing to take responsibility and, potentially, future property taxes, should their status change. It cost a significant sum, not just the old taxes, but legal fees, filing fees, surveyor fees, to precisely identify the boundaries of these parcels based on the corrected legal descriptions we painstakingly redrafted. It was a gamble, a massive one. I was essentially buying roads and bits of park in my own neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on me. While this complex legal chess game was unfolding in the background, Penelope Price, blissfully unaware, continued her reign of terror. The 20-0 fine demand had become a formal lien filed against my property. I received increasingly threatening letters from the HOA's law firm, a rather second-rate outfit that clearly specialized in HOA collections. They were smug, condescending, and utterly clueless about the earthquake brewing beneath their clients' feet. They probably saw me as just another homeowner trying to wriggle out of legitimate dues. I paid the lien under protest, just to avoid any forced sale complications while my own plan matured. This, of course, emboldened Penelope further. She probably thought she'd won, that I'd finally caved. I even saw her preening at the community mailbox, giving me a saccharine, triumphant smile. "So glad we could resolve that little unpleasantness, Michael," she'd cooed. "It's so important for the community that everyone adheres to the rules." Little did she know, the rules of the game were about to change dramatically. And I was about to become the one who owned the entire playing field. The cost of acquiring these lands was substantial, north of 6 figures when all was said and done. A hefty price for justice. But I considered it an investment in my peace of mind, and a rather unique form of community improvement. As the final deeds were recorded in the County Land Records Office under Serene Pathways LLC, a profound sense of anticipation, and a little bit of trepidation, settled in. I now, quite literally, owned the roads that Penelope Price and many of my neighbors used every single day. I owned the charming little, if neglected, Greenbelt Park where kids occasionally played. The implications were enormous. The final act of preparation involved commissioning a new survey of the lands now owned by Serene Pathways LLC. This survey meticulously flagged the boundaries of my newly acquired property. I then had a series of professional, very official-looking signs made. Private property, Serene Pathways LLC. Access by permit only. Violators will be prosecuted for trespass. All rights reserved. And smaller, more pointed ones. This road is private property. Unauthorized, use prohibited. The trap was meticulously set. All I needed was for Penelope to make one more move, one more act of HOA overreach to spring it. And, like clockwork, she obliged. Perhaps emboldened by my payment of the 20-0 lien, which she mistook for capitulation, the HOA sent out a fresh wave of violation notices for various minor infractions around the neighborhood, including a new one for me. The basketball hoop in my driveway, which had been there for 3 years without complaint, was suddenly out of compliance with aesthetic standards. The proposed fine, $250. It was so petty, so predictable. It was the perfect trigger. The following Monday morning, under the cloak of a pre-dawn gloom, a small team of trusted contractors I'd hired moved through Harmony Creek Estates like ghosts. By the time the sun rose, my new signs were prominently displayed at every entrance point to the roads now owned by Serene Pathways LLC and around the perimeter of the parkland. The effect, I imagined, would be rather startling. The moment of revelation arrived not with a bang, but with a flurry of confused and angry phone calls, first to the HOA management company, then directly to Penelope Price. I know this because Carol, the nervous HOA secretary, later recounted the sheer panic that erupted in their little office. Homeowners woke up to find that the roads they'd driven on for years were suddenly declared private property, not by the HOA, but by some unknown entity called Serene Pathways LLC. My phone started ringing too, but I let it go to voicemail. I was already on my way to my lawyer, Evelyn Reed's office. We had prepared the next salvo, a formal, legally drafted cease and desist letter and a notice of trespass, along with a substantial invoice addressed to the Harmony Creek Estates HOA and, significantly, to each individual member of the HOA, including Penelope Price, Barry, Janice, and Arthur. The invoice was for unauthorized use and trespass upon lands owned by Serene Pathways LLC. I calculated it based on a reasonable daily access fee per household, multiplied by the number of households in the affected sections, and made it retroactive for a period of 30 days prior to the official notification. The grand total? A staggering $20 million. Calculated to include a premium for the ongoing willful disregard after previous notice, the signs. Of course, $20 million was an anchor, a negotiating position designed to cause maximum shock and reflect the gravity of their past overreach with my 20-0, but the underlying claim of trespass, that was very, very real. Evelyn arranged for process servers to deliver these packages simultaneously. One to the HOA's management office, one to Penelope Price's home address. I made sure they served her personally. I would have paid extra to see her face. And copies mailed to every single homeowner in Harmony Creek. The reaction, as expected, was apocalyptic. My security camera footage from that day, still running but now for my amusement, showed Penelope's Escalade tearing out of her driveway, presumably heading towards the HOA office or her lawyer. The neighborhood online forum, usually a sleepy place for lost cat posters and recommendations for plumbers, exploded. People were confused, scared, and increasingly furious. Initially, some of that fury was directed at this mysterious Serene Pathways LLC. Who were they? How could they do this? But as the implications sank in, and as the covering letter from Evelyn Reed explained the legal basis, clear title ownership by Serene Pathways LLC of common access routes, the anger began to shift. Questions started being asked. How could the HOA let this happen? Why weren't these lands properly secured? What had Penelope and the board been doing all these years besides hassling people over parked cars and basketball hoops? An emergency HOA meeting was called for that very evening in the clubhouse that, as it turned out, was on land still legitimately owned by the HOA, a small mercy for them, I suppose. I decided to attend. Why not? It was, after all, my stage now. The atmosphere in the clubhouse was electric with tension and barely suppressed panic. Penelope Price stood at the front, her usual smug composure replaced by a flushed face and a quiver in her voice. Barry and Janice flanked her, looking pale and bewildered. Arthur Jenkins, the treasurer, sat slightly apart, wringing his hands. The room was packed with angry homeowners, all clutching their copies of the $20 million invoice and the trespass notice. Penelope began, "Residents, there appears to be a highly unusual and aggressive action taken by an outside entity. We are consulting with our legal counsel, and we assure you," she was interrupted by a shout from the back. "Outside entity? Who owns these roads, Penny? Did you know about this?" Penelope stammered. "This is a complex legal matter." That was my cue. I stood up. "Actually, Penelope," I said, my voice calm and carrying easily in the sudden silence, "it's not that complex. Serene Pathways LLC, of which I am the managing member, legally purchased these lands. Here are copies of the recorded deeds, certified by the county." I had a stack of them, and I began passing them around. The rustle of paper was the only sound for a moment. Then, uproar. "You did this, Mike?" someone yelled. "Why?" I let the question hang for a moment, then looked directly at Penelope. Perhaps Penelope can explain why an HOA would levy 20-0 in fines against a resident for lawfully parking his own vehicles on his own property, or why she felt it necessary to wage a personal vendetta against my family based on fabricated violations. I then detailed my ordeal, the escalating, baseless fines, the ignored evidence, the lien, the constant harassment. This HOA, under Mrs. Price's leadership, I continued, has consistently overreached, abused its power, and acted in bad faith. So, I used my resources and knowledge to protect my rights in a way you couldn't ignore. Serene Pathways LLC now owns the primary access roads and substantial common areas in this development. Every time you drive on those roads, you are technically trespassing on private property, unless you have an access agreement with the owner, which is me. The color drained completely from Penelope's face. Barry looked like he was about to faint. Janice just stared, mouth agape. This is outrageous." Penelope finally sputtered. "You can't do this. We'll sue you. We'll have you arrested." I smiled faintly. "On what grounds, Penelope?" "I have the deeds. I own the land. You and the HOA are the ones who have been trespassing. And that 20 million invoice? It's a starting point for negotiations for past and future access. Or, of course, you can all find alternative routes to your homes. Though, looking at the plat maps, that might be tricky." The sheer, delightful irony of the situation was not lost on me. Penelope Price, the queen of rules and regulations, was now facing a rule she couldn't bend, a boundary she couldn't cross without permission. The hunter had become the prey, and her own kingdom was now, quite literally, at my mercy. The ensuing chaos in that clubhouse was a sight to behold. The emergency HOA meeting descended into pure pandemonium. Homeowners were shouting, demanding answers from a visibly crumbling Penelope Price. Her attempts to regain control were futile. "Our lawyers will handle this! This is illegal!" she shrieked, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Evelyn Reed, my attorney, who had discreetly positioned herself near the back, chose this moment to speak. Her voice, cool and authoritative, cut through the din. "Actually, Mrs. Price, it is perfectly legal. Serene Pathways LLC holds valid recorded deeds to the properties in question. Any attempt by the HOA or its members to continue using these roads and lands without an access agreement will result in further legal action for trespass, including seeking injunctive relief and damages." That quieted the room considerably. The raw fear on people's faces was palpable. They were trapped, and they knew it. Many glared at Penelope, the architect of their current predicament. Arthur Jenkins, the timid treasurer, surprisingly found his voice. "Penelope, I warned you about escalating these fines against Mr. Henderson here without proper basis. I told you the discretionary legal spending was getting out of control." This was news to many, and a fresh wave of anger was directed at the board. The meeting ended without any resolution, just a lot of frightened, angry people and a dethroned queen. Predictably, the Harmony Creek Estates HOA, under Penelope's frantic direction, sued Serene Pathways LLC. They sought to invalidate our deeds, claiming fraud, improper conveyance, and anything else their increasingly desperate and probably very expensive new law firm could dream up. Their old firm, the collection specialists, were clearly out of their depth. The lawsuit was a desperate Hail Mary, and Evelyn was more than prepared. We filed a countersuit for trespass, seeking enforcement of our property rights and damages, starting with that 20 million figure, which certainly got the court's attention. The legal battle was intense but surprisingly swift. The judge, an experienced jurist who had seen his share of bizarre property disputes, was not amused by the HOA's arguments. Evelyn systematically dismantled their case. The deeds were valid. The acquisition process, while unconventional, was legal. Hemlock Properties Inc. had been dissolved with clouded assets. Serene Pathways LLC had legally acquired them. The judge took a particularly dim view of the HOA's past behavior, especially when Evelyn presented evidence of the 20-0 fine against me for the car issue, complete with Penelope's photo-taking expeditions. The judge practically rolled his eyes when the HOA's lawyer tried to justify the aesthetic concerns. He stated quite clearly, "This court is not in the business of validating vendettas dressed up as bylaw enforcement. Property rights are fundamental. Serene Pathways LLC owns the land. The HOA and its members have been trespassing." He urged both parties to reach a settlement regarding access, or he would be forced to issue an injunction that could, quite literally, bar residents from reaching their homes via my roads. That threat was the final nail in the HOA's coffin. Panic ensued amongst the homeowners. Suddenly, my phone was ringing off the hook, not with anger, but with pleas for a reasonable solution. They understood finally that Penelope's tyranny had led them to the brink of disaster. The settlement negotiations were interesting. The HOA was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt in the face of my claim and the legal fees they'd incurred. They couldn't pay $20 million or even $1 million. Penelope, Barry, and Janice were forced to resign from the board as a precondition for any talks. A new interim board was hastily formed, led by none other than a reluctant but resolute Arthur Jenkins, the former treasurer, and a few other sensible homeowners who had previously stayed silent. My primary goals were recoup my expenses, the 20-0 bogus fine, the cost of acquiring the land, my legal fees, ensure this kind of abuse could never happen again, and, frankly, make sure Penelope Price understood the consequences of her actions. We didn't want to evict people from their homes. That was never the plan. The 20 million figure was designed to bring them to the table, cap in hand, and to ensure the lesson stuck. We settled for a figure that was still substantial enough to be painful, but manageable if spread across the entire community through a series of hefty special assessments over several years. The final settlement amount was in the low seven figures, which covered all my costs and then some. Critically, the HOA also had to publicly retract the fines against me, issue a formal apology, and expunge any negative record. Furthermore, they had to agree to a complete overhaul of their CC rupees, reviewed and approved by Evelyn, to remove ambiguous language, clarify rules, and establish a fair and transparent enforcement process with an independent appeals board. No more secret committees or unilateral decisions by the president. As for Penelope Price, her downfall was swift and brutal. She was publicly disgraced. The settlement terms, while primarily burdening the HOA, had clauses that allowed for scrutiny of past financial mismanagement. Arthur Jenkins, now armed with real authority, initiated a forensic audit of the HOA's books under Penelope's reign. The audit uncovered significant misuse of funds, particularly from that discretionary fund, and the excessive legal fees on frivolous matters. While not directly part of my settlement, the findings led to further legal woes for Penelope personally, as some residents considered a derivative lawsuit against her for breach of fiduciary duty. She and her husband put their house on the market within months and moved away, her escalate presumably tailgating someone in a new, unsuspecting community. Barry and Janice also faded into obscurity, resigning from all community involvement. The financial impact on the remaining homeowners was significant. Those special assessments were a bitter pill to swallow for years. Some people did have to sell, unable to bear the extra cost on top of their mortgages. It was unfortunate, but it was the price of allowing unchecked power to fester. Property values in Harmony Creek took a temporary hit due to the widely publicized road ownership scandal, as the local papers gleefully dubbed it. So, what happened to the roads and common lands owned by Serene Pathways LLC? After the settlement and the reforms were firmly in place, I had a few options. I could have continued to own them and charge an annual access fee. I could have sold them to a third-party investor. But my goal wasn't perpetual landlordship over my neighbors. Once the new, reformed HOA was stable and had proven its commitment to fair governance for a couple of years, Serene Pathways LLC sold all the acquired lands back to the Harmony Creek Estates HOA for a nominal fee, essentially the original acquisition cost, not the inflated settlement value. It was a gesture of goodwill, but also a tactical move to ensure long-term peace. They now had clear title and a very clear understanding of their responsibilities. The neighborhood slowly healed. The HOA meetings became less about personal power plays and more about actual community management. Arthur Jenkins, to his credit, proved to be a capable and fair leader. The park got new benches, the pool got fixed, and the clubhouse was repainted. The basketball hoop stayed in my driveway, untouched. My cars, the Corvette Kate, Sarah's Audi Quate, and Emily's Audi RS5 when she visited, remained parked as we pleased, well within the now clearly defined and reasonable guidelines. Nobody ever mentioned them again. Sometimes, I still can't believe I bought half the neighborhood to win a dispute over parking. It was extreme, yes, but it was a response to an extreme abuse of power. The satisfaction wasn't just in the financial outcome or in seeing Penelope Price get her comeuppance. It was in restoring a semblance of fairness and common sense, in showing that one person, pushed too far, can indeed fight City Hall, or in this case, a tyrannical HOA president. And the biggest win? Peace and quiet, and the undisputed right to park my own damn cars in my own damn driveway. It's funny, the ripple effects. I heard stories that other HOAs in the region became a lot more circumspect in their dealings after word of the Harmony Creek uprising got around. Maybe, just maybe, my little suburban war served a larger purpose. So, that's my crazy HOA story. What's the wildest HOA rule you've ever encountered? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, you know what to do. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. It was quite the journey.